You're listening to The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
We're very lucky that Tom Nichols is back with us here sort of to round out the year. He's staff writer at The Atlantic. He writes their daily newsletter, which is terrific. He, as I said last time, he taught at the U.S. Naval War College for 25 years. He writes books that matter, including Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on American Democracy, and that was a year ago and more correct than I think he probably hoped. Anyway, Tom, welcome back.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Hey, a few weeks ago, I said that Trump would have the shortest honeymoon of any president in my lifetime, and I think I was wrong. I think he's going to have the shortest honeymoon of any president in our history.
Well, you could argue that he's already had one honeymoon, and you only get one to a customer. But messing up the budget deal at the behest of Elon Musk is pretty much a way to wear out your welcome, even with your own party, pretty fast. So I've never seen a honeymoon end actually before the inauguration. So that's really an achievement.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And the Republicans might not. I mean, they may be in yet another speaker fight.
Well, because they're not really a party anymore. I mean, they don't, or I should say, the old political scientist in me, as you know, I taught for a lot of years before I became a writer. The political scientist in me says they're not really acting like a party. They're sort of a cult of personality with a loose coalition of other interests attached to it. So there's really, it's strange because when it comes to voting, at least out in the country, the Republicans have a huge amount of party discipline. When it comes to actually doing anything inside the government, they can't get along with each other. And you're right. I mean, it could. I suspect that cooler heads will prevail. That they don't want to go into Trump's renewed term with with an ugly speaker fight. But it's important to remember Mike Johnson was sort of the one guy they could all. I mean, he was basically chosen because he was the guy everybody hated the least.
Last man standing. Yeah.
He was the last man. Yeah, exactly. It's sort of the only guy left after everybody else was knocked out. So it's he was never in the strongest position.
There are a bunch of these Republicans who are seriously saying they want to have Elon Musk be their speaker.
Yeah, I wonder how serious they really are about that. They have to know what an inane spectacle that would be. Especially to have a speaker who has even if it weren't Musk, if it were somebody else from outside the institution who has no knowledge of processes, doesn't know the members, has no idea what committees are what, it would just be a disaster. But I think what you're seeing is some Republicans are just sort of cheaply currying favor with Musk's fans, with Musk's admirers. And so, there's so much performative stuff going on with the Republicans where they just say things without any real expectation of ever having to do them. But it's kind of a quick sugar rush to just say them out loud. So I don't know how serious. I think Rand Paul was one of them. Am I getting that right? I think
maybe. Sounds right, doesn't it?
It was. Yeah, but apologies to Senator Paul if it wasn't him. But I don't think anybody who said this really. The Republicans are dogs who sometimes catch the cars they chase. But I think in this case, I don't think anybody really expects that to happen.
What's so interesting to me, and I guess this has crept up on me over time, is that I didn't understand how much the Republicans, not the voters, but the electeds, are they're fearful about everything. They act in fear all the time. Fear of somebody's money, fear of social media, fear of being primaried from the right. They're a party of people who are scared of their own shadow. And, we're facing legitimate challenges in the world. A little courage would go a long way.
Well, I've been stealing this line from George Will for years now, that when George said, back several years ago. He said it's a new experience in American history where the GOP is the first major political party that actually fears and to some extent hates its own voters. Because I think you're right, Ed. I mean, they're constantly, who's going to, you saw it with Musk now. I mean, you have somebody outside of politics jumping in on this and saying, I'll primary you. I'll make sure you get primaried. And I think the problem is that for a lot of these folks, being in Congress, and this is a bipartisan problem, but I think especially now, being in Congress and being in Washington is the most important thing to a lot of these folks. They don't want to go home. They certainly don't want to have to leave the institution and go back and live among the voters that are sending them angry messages. And so you're right. They're afraid. I mean, they're afraid of everything. They're afraid of money coming into their opponent's war chest. They're afraid of being primaried. They're afraid of being dragged in public or on social media by Donald Trump. I mean, I imagine that most Republican electeds wake up every morning and say, basically get out of bed and say, now what?
Right. Or who's going to tell me what to do today? Let's see. So I thought a lot since the election about whether my optimism is just plain wrong in the face of the challenges we face. I mean, we have the best thing about the Republican government is that it might be dysfunctional, because if they get their act together and do the things they promise, it'll be really terrible. And I've tried to be clear-eyed about what's in front of us. Here's where I come down, and I wonder how you think about this. I think the challenges are going to prove my optimism was correct. I mean, we've had this existential doom before, the Civil War, the Depression, the Gilded Age, Jim Crow. In all of those eras, huge populations of America thought things were okay that aren't okay. I mean, they were in favor. Lots were in favor of Jim Crow. Half the country was in favor of secession, right? Or half of the geography was in favor of secession. Today, millions of Americans think some things that really aren't okay are fine. But I think our values and aspirations will prevail, and the fight will help them prevail. And I sort of want your take on. I can't ask that question of most people, but I think you can get it.
Yeah, I do, and I understand it, and I'm kind of there with you. I mean, on one level, I assume that given what we saw in the last Trump administration, that competence is not exactly going to be a hallmark of this administration. There's a lot of, on top of people who don't know what they're doing, there's a lot of backbiting and infighting. I mean, as you were pointing out with the House, with the chaos in the House, the coterie around Trump is kind of a Game of Thrones group. A lot of them don't like each other. They're constantly undermining each other. They're, constantly ratting each other out. So a lot of things that would require a really unified, coherent, professional cadre of, activists just won't get done, because that's just not who this group of people are. Now, the one person I always point to in these discussions, where the guy that I think flies under the radar and the kind of appointee that you want to pay attention to, is somebody like Russ Vought, who's going to be at OMB. And
totally,
he's smart. He thinks about this stuff. He has a plan. He stays out of these other cat fights. That in some ways, that guy, a guy like that is more dangerous than Ambassador Kimberly Guilfoyle or something.
Right. And Stephen Miller.
But I share. Well, even Miller. I mean, remember, Miller's the guy that, piped up in a meeting, and General Milley turned to him and said, "Shut the F up."
Yeah.
I mean, Stephen Miller doesn't exactly intimidate a lot of people in a place like Washington, and probably won't this time around either. He's a source of a lot of bad ideas and a lot of overcooked speeches. But again, there's kind of a limit on what all these folks can do. Now, with that said, they say good writers borrow, great writers steal. Another comment I've stolen from my friend David Frum, he said this time around the Velociraptors have learned how to work the doorknobs. So there are going to be people who learned from. It's a great line. David said that some years ago, and I've been pillaging it ever since, pilfering it ever since. So, but I share your pessimism that no matter how this turns out, if all of this collapsed tomorrow, if Trump were impeached, by the end of the year or so, who knows? You still are facing the fact that tens of millions of people heard the terrible things that Donald Trump said, and they think it's okay. And I wrestle with that. I have a really hard time when a presidential candidate says other Americans are vermin and scum, and tens of millions of people say, yeah, I'm okay with that as long as because eggs are expensive. That depresses me as an American in a very fundamental way.
I don't think most Americans believe that other Americans are scum and vermin. I think they think that politics, and the Republicans did this, that politics is just like the wrestling matches where people say it and it's performative and they don't mean it.
Right. It's theater. And so they say, well, it doesn't really matter. But, there have to be limits. There has to be a moment. And I don't care who it is. I actually, it shows you how far we've come. I actually got into sort of a snit many years ago when President Obama said, remember, voting is the best revenge. And I said, you don't want to hear a president talk about voting as revenge. Yeah. I said, look, I think President Obama is a decent guy. Like John, I always love John McCain's comment about him. He's a good family man with whom I have significant disagreements, But I thought, that was a little over the line. Of course, by today's standards, that seems quaint. That seems almost polite. And I really wish people would draw a line to say, look, I'm not a liberal. I don't like the Democratic Party. I don't like their policies, but I'm not going to approve or turn away or wave it off when a former president and future president says that the people who oppose me are human scum. There just has to be a line there. And I take your point, Ed. There are a lot of people said, I agree with you. I think most Americans don't think of each other that way. Yeah. But, when you accept that kind of rhetoric in your public life enough times, it starts to change you.
Well, I agree with that. But I'm not pessimistic in this, that even though that's what a lot of Americans believe. Again, in other periods of our history, a lot of Americans thought Jim Crow was a good idea. A lot of Americans thought a lot of terrible things were good ideas in our history, and we overcame it because the founding ideas that we have are really powerful.
Well, we overcame them, but sometimes at great human cost.
I agree with that. The Civil War was great human cost.
I don't even mean the Civil War. I mean the Civil Rights Movement of the mid-20th century.
Also great cost.
At great human cost that included a lot of violence and the deaths of a lot of people and a lot of riots and a lot of lynchings and a lot of church bombings. And, I'm kind of hoping that we can get to better places without having to go through these convulsions. But it's interesting you bring up Jim Crow, because I think when people ask me how, and again, thank you for mentioning the books, because they are, I've tried to think about, well, how do we get past this? And I think some of it, unfortunately, is going to be the way we got past Jim Crow, which is by a combination of, yes, legislation and social activism, but some of it is just going to be demographic change. There are people who went to their graves thinking segregation now, segregation forever. And some of those people lived right into the 1980s and 90s and 2000s. And you're just not going to convince those folks. And so you just have to hope that you can, that good people can prevail in larger numbers, but some of those folks are just going to always be with us and think that way. And I'm unfortunately, I think that's the situation we're going to be in now.
I don't disagree with that. I mean, it's a gigantic country. I mean, we're going to. Well, I was going to say we'd get to 400 million, but that depends on what we do with immigration. But we're a very, very big country, and we're going to disagree about a lot of things, which is why we have a democracy, so we can figure out how to disagree in a way that lets us move forward.
Right.
Let's turn.
I'm worried that democracy Well, I'll just say I've always worried that democracy in America, it doesn't fall from coast to coast or, becomes a dictatorship tomorrow, that in pockets of places that people's rights are curtailed depending on where they live. And the thing that, again, that's a concern and some of the kind of pessimistic approach I have, simply to say, if the Constitution of the United States does not operate everywhere and always, then you're not the constitutional republic you believe yourself to be. And I think that's going to be the challenge, is to say, yes, we have differences among us and we can work them out. We're a big, sprawling federal state. But the one thing we all have to agree on is the Constitution. And I think that there has not been the same wide, maybe I was always naive to think that there was broad agreement on that, but it feels like the Constitution itself is kind of up for grabs as a document right now.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is too.
So I don't want to be too dark.
No, I think it is too. And even beyond the Constitution, or not quite approaching the Constitution, I guess it's not beyond it. We've never lived in the country where everybody has been equally politically and socially free in every part of the country. We never have. And it's always been aspirational. I mean, I grew up in Richard J. Daley's Chicago, and politics was not. It was hard fought, but he won every time, and not because the playing field was even, but because he had an enormous patronage army that he used the government to pay for. So, right. I mean, we've always had these pockets. That's here in Chicago. It doesn't compare with the Jim Crow in the South, but it took a while for us to, and I think only recently in our life, in my lifetime, and then only in the last, I don't know, 1968 to maybe 80. I mean, just a short period of time where we actually thought we're going to get there. And then we started to do some other weird things. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm from Massachusetts, and so, when people complain about gerrymandering, I always have to hang my head because,
Jerry was your guy.
After one of our, he was our guy.
Yeah, Elderbridge, right? Elderbridge Jerry.
People talk about gerrymandering, I kind of hang my head, and I go, yeah, he's one of ours.
Yeah. All right. So I want to just talk about the world with you for a minute, because the last time we spoke, you and I were a little nostalgic for our lost Pax Americana. Those 80 years or so after World War II, where America provided a security umbrella and a system of international rules. We helped literally billions of humans rise from poverty. We provided a life of opportunity and meaning for most Americans and made the world more peaceful than any time in recorded history. Yeah, it looks like that's breaking all over the place now.
Well, okay. Let's be both optimistic and pessimistic. The pessimistic view is, and I began my career as a Russia expert, and actually I should say I'm old enough that I began my career as a Soviet expert. So that's how far back I go. And so sometimes I look at this situation, particularly in Europe, and I say, we defeated Soviet communism and millions of people gained their freedom. And for what? For this? For the biggest war in Europe since World War II? That it just feels like such a lost 30 years of a lost opportunity. Even Syria, which is a bright spot this month, was liberated by a group that the United States considers a terrorist organization. it seems like the bad guys have gotten their act together, and they were on their back foot some years ago, and now they seem to be kind of recovering. Although, again, let's look at some bright spots, right? That Bolsonaro is going to go on trial in Brazil, and the polls have turned back a right-wing government. And we don't know what's going to happen in Germany, but the French snap elections actually pushed back the French right. And so there are causes for optimism.
South Korea.
Right. So, the bad news in South Korea is that their president tried to execute a coup. The good news is their legislators impeached him and they weren't having any of it. But the fact that it happened at all was a little, unsettling.
Right.
But it was, in fact, when I saw that I was traveling in Europe when all this was happening, and so I was only picking up snippets on the BBC, and I was like, I'm sorry, did martial law? They must mean North Korea.
I couldn't believe it either.
I thought this has to be wrong. They don't mean South Korea. Maybe there's a crisis in Pyongyang or something. But I want to drag some history into this for a minute. Everything we just said about the Pax Americana coming apart, that America's era is over, that we can't possibly recover from this. You and I are both old enough, Ed, to remember the late 1970s. This is exactly what everyone said. NATO is not going to make it to 1990. By 1980, you had actually in 1975, Gerald Ford. And let's remind people that for a while, America had an unelected president and vice president. That's how bad a situation we were in. But Gerald Ford was a good man, and he went to NATO and pleaded with NATO to stay together. He literally goes to Brussels and says, NATO still matters. And America's still here. We'd just been defeated in Vietnam. Our economy was completely on the skids. Soviet Union seemed to be in control of events all around the world. And you had America's partner in Britain, Prime Minister Callahan, saying basically, I think my job is to help manage Western decline. And who would have guessed that 10 years later, 1985, the Soviet Union is in the middle of this humongous crisis. NATO is as strong and as powerful as it ever was. The United States was back on top economically and militarily. So I just want to say to people, yes, right now things look bleak, but it's not the first time that things have looked bleak like this. And I would argue that even in that 1974, 75, we did not go into the bicentennial of 1976. It was worse. I thank you for saying that, because every time I try and say this to younger folks, they say, "Oh, Professor, you just don't understand." And I'm like, "No, I'm sorry, but I was alive back then. It was definitely worse." Yeah, it was worse. So we got through it once. We can get through it again.
Well, and I'm optimistic for another reason. I don't see the autocracies of the world actually delivering for their people. I mean, we didn't deliver so well for ours, which is one of the reasons why we had the election we had. But maybe except for in the GCC, where gobs of oil money are letting them buy a higher standard of living for their people. But Russia's an economic disaster, probably a client state of China. China's powerful, but it's stagnant and aging. You got Moldova and Georgia, trying to say, hey, we don't want to be under the Russian thumb. Syria we don't know what they're doing, but they did whatever they did. I mean, this desire that we've talked about, I know it seems old-fashioned, but the desire to be free, it seems to be bubbling to the surface all over the world. If we didn't have the administration we have coming in, this would be a great moment for human freedom.
Well, it would be a crisis moment for human freedom in the traditional sense of a crisis, where you're at the moment where things either get much better or much worse.
Yep.
And I think, that's unfortunately, and I just wrote a piece a couple of days ago in the Atlantic where I said the unfortunate thing is that Russia really is kind of on its back foot. And unfortunately, they're going to get an American administration that's going to rescue them. At exactly the time that we should have been squeezing them, we're gonna let them up off the mat, and I think that's really a problem. I think that's unfortunate. But
so I want to ask you about that. Trump is, I know he's been Putin's biggest supporter. I mean, he famously told everybody that he trusted Putin's word more than he trusted our own intelligence services. He held that disgusting secret meeting with Sergei Lavrov in the Oval Office. But Trump is pathologically triggered by what he perceives he's stronger than the guy across him. Weakness triggers him in a crazy way. And he's cruel. I mean, and Putin is now weaker than he was 4 years ago, 8 years ago, when all this happened. I mean, Russia's really weaker. Putin is weaker. And it's possible that Trump, because, no one stays in his graces, even Putin, he's going to see a weaker guy across the table. And I don't know. He might actually decide to take advantage of it. Not with Tulsi Gabbard and Pete Hegseth, but, he might.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I mean, he seems to have a deep-seated insecurity about Putin that I don't think has anything to do with the strength of Russia at any given moment. I think his fear of Putin is rooted in a lot of things. First, he has a long history with Russia, and he's dealt with a lot of bad boys over the years in Russia, and Putin. It may just be that Putin reminds him of all that, but more to the point, Putin is very much a bully and a tough guy and a gangster in his own right, and I think he just gets the better of Trump because he's just better at this game than Trump is. It's really weird when you watch them together back when Trump was president, how kind of creepily deferential Trump is, to a guy who's really, just a kind of a petty dictator now. So I take your point that he may be saying, hey, Putin's really up against the wall. He's got himself into a jam. But he really likes strong men. And remember always that he has that Trump has a real grudge about Ukraine. That's the country that where his chicanery got him impeached.
Yeah. So, I was grasping at the only straw I could find.
Well, yeah, there could be. The problem is that everybody around him, the guy he just nominated to be his envoy to Ukraine, really buys into all the nonsense about how, we kind of triggered this because we made too much noise about Ukraine joining NATO. And, it's very much the blame America first crowd. So I just it's hard to imagine that he's going to suddenly turn on a dime, especially after traveling the country and saying, well, I can end this in a day. And, we have to stop spending all this money. When Trump's envoy says, we'll dump weapons on Ukraine if Putin won't come to the table, you really have to take that with a whole salt mine, because what that really means is Putin will say, okay, fine, I'll come to the table. And then everybody will say, great, mission accomplished. And then we will all look away while Putin catches his breath and continues to violate ceasefires or other conditions. So I want to believe, I want to grasp at that straw with you, Ed, but I don't think it's strong enough to hold both of us.
Yep. All right. I will let it go. Let's turn home for a minute. And there's just so much to talk about. We began with this dysfunctional House, but this week, GOP Congressman Barry Loudermilk, he released the first draft of, I guess, I don't know what else to call it except the fake show trial indictments. I mean, this was the government-led effort to whitewash January 6th and to prosecute Liz Cheney and others who actually did investigate January 6th. Is this what's the future of that?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but listening to other lawyers talk about this, it doesn't seem like that's something that can go anywhere As like you say, a show trial. I mean, I suppose what they can do is they can, just make Liz Cheney miserable and have to spend money on lawyers and, show up in front of the House or whatever they can do. One of the bigger questions I always have in this is the remarkable way. Two questions. One is how did we get to a point where so many Americans memory hold January 6th? Again, this is one of the worst days in American history. American political history. I mean, it's not as bad as the Battle of the Bulge or Antietam or something, but in American political history, this is clearly one of the worst days our democracy ever had. And yet, I think it's amazing that kind of the right-wing media machine has really just gotten millions of people say, okay, yeah, it's not that big a deal. Now, for that, I think you can also blame messaging on the other side. I mean, to me, January 6th should not have been treated like old news. It should have been treated as the most important thing in the world. But the other thing I always wonder is, millions of people who are not part of the MAGA base voted for Donald Trump. Is this what they voted for? I mean, the people who said they went to the polls because interest rates are high and eggs are too expensive and rent is too steep, is the answer to let Elon Musk bully the House and that, congressmen are going to spend their time trying to indict Liz Cheney for the crime of pissing them off? Really, it shows you kind of how, and I guess goes back to my point about how the Republicans just aren't really a party anymore. It speaks to how just unserious a political movement they are. They're not
it's
really
not a governing
getting anything done. I mean,
it's definitely not a governing movement.
I mean, at some point, don't you? I mean, you come from Chicago, politics. At some point, you got to fill potholes, right?
You got to govern.
At some point,
you got to do the job.
You got to govern. You got to pave the streets. You got to make sure the lights go on. And it's just remarkable to me that I think how the Republicans basically say, look, other people. When you brought up the issue of competence earlier. There is a kind of a weird tribute that Republicans give to the competence of government bureaucrats, because it seems like they say, we can go and do all this performative, these crazy theatrics, because somebody else is going to run things and everything will work.
The deep state.
They say we're going to deconstruct. Yeah, we're going to deconstruct the administrative state. But in the meantime, as long as they're making water come out of the taps and keeping the airspace open for flights, that we're okay with that. And it really is. It really shows you just the degree to which this is about political theater to keep people in their jobs in Washington, and getting reelected.
Well. Yeah, that political theater becomes something else when Donald Trump pardons all the January 6th insurrectionists. I mean, to go back to that, because I think we can stay on January 6th for a while. You and I have the same view about it. I talked to other people who also think it was a terrible day for America, but they think it's a terrible day because they believe that Joe Biden lost an election, stole his way into the presidency. And the bad thing about that day is the folks who were there to get the real vote approved didn't win. It's fantasy, it's lies, but a lot of people believe it.
It shows you, and I actually talked just before the election, the way I knew that we were kind of doomed and that, we weren't going to have a healthy political discussion going to this election. I talked to a Trump voter in Pennsylvania just a few days before the election, and talking about the election being rigged and how suddenly she started talking about Michelle Obama and Canadians rigging Pennsylvania machines, and this was like an intelligent older lady, ran a business, and I just found myself saying, what? And you can't reason with that kind of, bubble mentality, because, of course, now that Trump has won, they're back to, yes, American elections are fair. Well, so when Trump was in charge, he lost because the election was rigged. When Biden was in charge, Biden lost because the election was fair. None of this makes any sense. There is no logic to it. It's purely just if we win, elections are good. If we lose, elections are bad. And that's a really dangerous problem in a democracy. And Trump, talking about Trump pardoning the January 6th people, one thing about political theater, and I'm going to steal yet another from another great writer, Kurt Vonnegut. In his book Mother Night, Kurt Vonnegut has a line that has always haunted me about politics, where he says in the introduction, "We are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful what we pretend to be." Meaning that if you act out this stuff enough times, if you engage in this political theater enough times, if you accept this kind of rhetoric enough times, you become that thing. You're not just playing at it. You really turn into the thing that you thought you were just sort of pantomiming and playing at for the sake of politics. And I worry about that because I think a lot of Americans and certainly a lot of people in elected office seem to be believing. I always wonder, for example, about somebody like the nominee for UN ambassador, Lee Stefanik, who was this very moderate George H.W. Bush kind of middle-of-the-road Republican who now is, full-throated MAGA supporter. And you can say, well, she said that because she comes from a very red district and she had to kind of survive and deal with Trump and all that stuff. But, at some point, if you say that stuff enough times, aren't you then isn't that you after you've said it enough times?
It's a really fascinating question, Tom. And for me, in politics, it doesn't matter. The part that doesn't matter is if it's really her or not. That matters to the people who love you. That matters to your family and your friends. But it was it was Machiavelli, right? Who said you have to be the prince to know the people and the people to know the prince. And what he meant was there's this theater, there's this distance. The person, whatever your private motivations are, what matters is what you do in politics. What matters in governing is what you do.
But I think it does matter in terms of where you'll draw the line. If, at some point, if it's just theater, there's a part of you that says this far and no farther, that there are things that you will make you resign or walk away. And you saw that in the first Trump administration where there were, people who said there are just things I'm not going to do. I think the problem is if it becomes who you are, then everything becomes possible. Then there's all sorts of villainy that you are capable of because you've just kind of you've convinced yourself that you're that person.
I agree with you.
And I
think they are those
people. I take
people.
your point that
as far as we're concerned,
that's what.
Until they show us where a line is, this is who they are.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And by the way,
that's a good point. Yeah.
In the last government, we had Rex Tillerson, who failed and got pushed out. This government is filled with Rex Tillersons.
I wonder. Tillerson was never on board with the whole MAGA project. He was brought in to be, here, you're a manager, you ran a big company, go fix the State Department. My concern, and I've said this before, is that, Rex Tillerson would seem like a startling upgrade if most of the nominees for this cabinet were more like Rex Tillerson. You'd almost breathe a sigh of relief. Instead, and I said this the other day, it's like when you start talking about Trump's these most recent cabinet picks, it's like you're casting the cold open of Saturday Night Live.
Dangerously, sure, very dark. Kash Patel is. There are people who should be nowhere near government. Kash Patel is one of them.
Right.
Pam Bondi might be one of them. RFK certainly should not have a health portfolio. And Pete Hegseth. Oh my God.
Tulsi Gabbard.
Gabbard. Yeah. That's what
I mean. You almost say this and you say, wait, did I just say this out loud? Did I just say, you almost can't parse the words Secretary of Defense nominee Pete Hegseth. Because it's you almost think it almost sounds like a prank. And I think some of that is what's happened, by the way, in these nominations. I think Trump is trolling the country by saying, you guys, a lot of people betrayed me. You kicked me out of office. How do you like these apples? Watch what I'm going to do now because I can.
Well, we can't let him.
It's understandable from Trump's point of view because he doesn't really understand how government works. I think that's the other thing that is always striking about this. I think Trump has no idea what cabinet secretaries do, what DNI does, none of it. But that's where we are now.
Well, he does have an idea, Tom. His ideas, they do what I tell them to do. That's his idea. And it's, forget the Constitution.
How things actually work day to day. How things work day to day is a mystery.
Mystery. So I look. The area that I guess so many of it actually terrify me, but the weaponized justice system, the risks of abuse in like the Federal Protective Services or using the Insurrection Act could really cause absolute terror in America. But to tie this back to conversation earlier about how, in your view, this is a little like Jim Crow, I think this is an era that will create heroes. America hasn't done this in a long time. We did through the Civil Rights era. We absolutely made heroes, people whose names are well known today, and that was a long time ago. I think we're in another one of those eras, and it sometimes takes the making of heroes and martyrs to get us through these tough times.
Well, I think in a strange way, Ed, I hope you're wrong, because the way those kinds of heroes are made are under great duress and at great cost.
I agree with you, but I do think that's where we are.
But the heroes, I think the people who are going to be heroes, a group of people that most Americans don't like very much, which is going to be lawyers. Just as it was in the first Trump administration. A lot of things that got stopped in the first Trump administration got stopped because of people who took the time to read the documents and the legislation and file suits and plod through. As you know, I'm a former Republican. I have a kind of conservative temperament. I'm not particularly enamored of big mass movements and marches, although I think there's an important moment. There are times when those kinds of actions are necessary, but I have great respect for the people who slog it out every day. I mean, you can talk about I want to resist and I'm going to march and I'm going to yell, but the people who just kind of slog it out every day and say, okay, here's an executive order from Donald Trump. Let's all sit down and decide how we're going to go to court about this, because that's what happened the last time.
That's what happens every time a Democrat issues an executive order. Every time.
Well, right. The Republicans were always really good at that.
Yeah. Wait, Tom, we have 1 minute left, and I want to ask you this. It's related to what you're talking about. I am the biggest critic of John Roberts, maybe in the country. I just think he sold us out in 1,000 ways. But it just might be that he set himself up as the only other power center to a president. And he may actually be called upon to do things to protect us now, and he might actually do them. What do you think?
Well, the Chief Justice seems to care very much about the court and its place in history and its standing in American society. And right now, the Supreme Court is, not a very popular institution.
Yes, less popular than the Chicago City Council, and that is a remarkable thing.
Well, on this, I want to believe. I want to be with you in your optimism, Ed. So let's take that as that we will end this on a note of shared optimism, that there may be things that even John Roberts simply says, are a bridge too far. On the other hand, let's remember that this is the court that produced Trump v. U.S. as a decision, basically saying that
presidents are kings.
Three justices. Right. Presidents are kings, and that you basically have three justices who say, we're never going to hold Donald Trump responsible for anything.
But they may not allow him to do everything. Yeah. Oh, you're not responsible for it, but you can't do it. And who knows? All right. Well, Tom, listen, I hope you have a fabulous Christmas and New Year's, and that you and I are mistaken to be worried. I doubt that, but let's just hope that for the next week or so.
All right. Merry Christmas, Ed.
Thanks. Take care. Bye.
Yep. Bye-bye.